It's springtime and I'm in this lovely park, and it's kind of hard to imagine that this neighborhood is the setting of this next episode that has to do with burials and death. There is a kindergarten right there next to this woods. It's teeming with life. And these kids probably come to this forested area to play sometimes. And what they don't know is that it's quite possible that there are a lot of burials here, that a lot of people have been buried in the grounds here. This forest. This hill I'm coming up on here is the possible site of an execution ground. And the town you can see below it is Uppsala. I am at one of the ancient execution sites in Uppsala. And this area is called Gallows Hill. Galgbacken. Gallows, Backe, Hill. An old map from the 17th century indicates that this is indeed an old execution site. Now this may have moved in time, because on later maps it's indicated that the execution site was a bit further north, a few hundred meters north of here. But that's quite common, that execution grounds moved locations. And this site has not only been an execution site in present day time, it's the location of a waterworks that is indicated here by all these funny looking things sticking out of the ground. So why are there a lot of people buried here, or possibly buried here? Well, back in the old days, when Sweden had the execution as a punishment method, it was quite common that the executed people were buried right next to the execution site. Yeah, it's quite steep here, as you can see from me tumbling over here. And it's quite rocky also, and I imagine that if there are burials, that they are under rocks like these. Up until the beginning of the 19th century, prison sentences were quite rare in Sweden, and the death penalty was a lot more common. You could be sentenced to death for some 68 types of crimes. Some common crimes a few hundred years ago that people were executed for was bestiality, robbery, and women were often executed for infanticide. And they would even execute underage people as young as 12, i.e. children. An execution was a significant affair. The evidence that they left in the form of purchase receipts, invoices, and written eyewitness accounts show that executions were carefully planned. was recorded meticulously and it drew big crowds. For an execution, skilled carpenters would build a scaffold where the execution would take place, oftentimes with a rail around it to hinder the doomed from escaping or hinder someone in the audience from coming up onto the scaffold to disturb the whole thing. And the doomed person was often taken to the place of execution by a horse-drawn carriage, sitting backwards on it so that they could see the long line of people on both sides of the road watching the prisoner go to his or her doom. Before 1650, the method of execution most commonly used was hanging, and that was a slow, painful way to die of suffocation. And after 1650, the execution was often done by beheading a person instead. And it was considered a swift, painless method of death. Well, that is, if the executioner knew what he was doing. It wasn't uncommon that the executioner had to swing the axe both 2 and even more times to separate the head from the body. And there were other ways of execution as well. For example, sometimes people would be buried alive, and in some cases people would be pierced on stakes by an incision would be made on their lower back, and a thick stake would be pushed through all the way up through the mouth, and then they would be placed like next to a road or something like that in order for everyone to see, and this was done while the person was still alive. After the beheading, the dead body was often cremated on the spot, especially if it was a woman who had committed a serious crime. Sometimes part of the punishment was to have body parts, such as your hands, chopped off prior to the execution, even up to several days beforehand. At other times, the punishment consisted of not only the execution itself, but also of the practice to chop body parts off after death and nail them onto wooden wheels or stakes erected in the forest nearby. In some instances, entire bodies were put on these wooden wheels or stakes, and there they would stay until they had been devoured by animals. And that was a way to set an example for people to not commit crimes. And this was mainly done to male bodies. This practice, that hailed from the medieval period, ceased in the mid-19th century. And bodies that weren't placed on wheels or stakes in that manner, they were often buried in the ground around the execution site. Now, the reason that executed people were not allowed to be buried in churchyards, but had to be buried near the execution site, was that executed people feared that they would come back and haunt the living afterwards. But if they remained in the forest, they might actually stay there. Each county was by law supposed to have an executioner, but this wasn't a very popular job. And it wasn't uncommon for the executioner to be a convict that had himself been sentenced to death, but instead had been offered the job of executioner. Since 1921, execution for crimes was abolished in Sweden, and for war crimes it was abolished in 1973. But in reality, the last execution in Sweden was done in 1910 in a prison. At the end of the era that Sweden had execution as a punishment method, the executions were done in prisons mainly, not outside for the public to view. But in the old days, I mean, entire villages would show up to watch an execution. The name of the last unfortunate soul to be executed here was Per Andersson, also known as Dalpelle. Dalpelle was an infamous bandit. Born in 1814, he was 35 when he met the death at the hands of the executioner. And he was known as a thief and a conman, and when he was violent, he called himself Dalpelle. But when he was himself a good person, as he claimed, he wanted to be known by his birth name, Per. He first learned how to steal when his mother asked him to steal food from the nearby farms during hard times, and also by a watchmaker who asked him to steal metal for his trade. As an adult, whenever he got caught committing a crime, Dalpelle would often find an ingenious way to escape justice, that is. Like the time when he escaped from Stockholm's and Sweden's most famous prison, Långholmen. He did it by swimming from the island underneath a bush. He also made fake passports in order to be able to travel, because back in those days, even traveling nationally, you needed a passport. Apart from being a criminal, Dalpelle was also a writer. He wrote 2 kind of strange books about himself, which contain his personal thoughts on what makes a criminal and how he thought they should be handled. For example, he didn't think that people of a young age should be put in prison, since the experience only hardened them and made them even worse criminals. The very sad part about Dalpelle is that when he came to a point in his life when he truly wanted to make a change and be a law-abiding citizen, and he and his family appealed to the leaders of the community back in his home village, they refused to accept him back to the village. And after that, he embarked on an even more crime-ridden journey. Well, he might as well, he reasoned. And after a fight, during which he received a blow to the head by a sable, his personality changed and he had regular fits of rage after that. And that's when he began to call his evil alter ego Dalpelle. It was when he was in prison and had one of those fits that he ended up stabbing a prison guard in the eye, and the guard died after a few days. And it's this murder that Dalpelle was sentenced to death for. Flippin' oh my god. I just came from down there's very steep and hard to climb, but we're up here again at the gallows hill, and standing here at the execution site, Dalpelle, he begged for forgiveness for his victims, from his victims and from God. And he said that his inheritance after his father that he got should go to the widow of the prison guard. And his final act is to donate his body to science, although some say his body is still buried somewhere here near the execution site. His skull still exists though, and its forehead has the writing on it that says Dalpelle, Great Thief and Murderer, 1949. No, 1849, sorry. It's said to be kept at Uppsala University, where it has been used in anatomy classes. And this view is probably what Dalpelle had to look at as his last few minutes on Earth came to an end. And you can see between the trees over there the spires of the cathedral, and these trees in the foreground probably weren't here, so you could probably have seen the castle as well. And Dalpelle's execution was the very last one to be held at this particular site, but not just in this site in general, but it was the last official execution in Uppsala as a whole. And the execution took place on March 24th in 1849, and it was a beheading. And almost 100 years later, a local newspaper wrote about this execution, and this is what they had to say. Early in the morning, Per Andersson was taken to the execution site that the maps call Gallows Hill. The convict was well prepared, calm, and showed great fortitude in his last moment, despite being deeply shaken. He said goodbye to the 3,000 or 4,000 people there and urged them not to take the same path as he did. Now, back in the mid-1800s, Uppsala only had about 7,000 inhabitants, so it seems that about half of the entire town came to witness this execution. Now, a place so connected with brutal sudden death is surely also connected with ghost sightings, right? Well, here is what I found about this Gallows Hill. It's not much, but in the 60s and 70s, people were talking about a woman dressed in black that was often seen haunting these grounds. And in general, it's common that execution sites are connected with sightings of headless ghosts. But there is also a group that travels around Sweden looking for ghost hauntings. And oftentimes they use a recording device and then they post their findings on YouTube afterwards. And this group, they have claimed to have captured some otherworldly voices on tape when recording at this execution site. And some of the words are said to be words connected to the last person executed there, so Dalpelle. Like, for example, his name was heard. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you're interested, stay tuned for the next one, which will be about a sacrificial stone and the nearby burials.